I'm sure you're all waving back. I love doing webinars. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today and for your ongoing support for the work of the NYCLU and the ACLU. As we approach the 1-year anniversary of the Dobbs decision, we thought it would be important to connect with our supporters and friends and talk about the current state of reproductive rights, health, and justice in the United States. We all thought it couldn't get much worse. Last Friday, right? And that was when an extreme Trump-appointed wackadoo judge, can I say that? Yeah, because nobody's going to tell me not to. This is a webinar. A Trump-appointed wackadoo judge ordered the FDA to revoke approval of mifepristone, an abortion medication that has been used by millions and millions of pregnant people safely for 23 years. This critical medication could soon be taken off the shelves in every hospital and clinic across the country. But not if we have anything to say about it. While a judge in Washington state immediately issued a contradictory ruling saying the FDA must do nothing to restrict the medication, and the Department of Justice has intervened to appeal the Texas ruling, the unprecedented threat of losing access to mifepristone means we in New York need to protect and expand access to abortion care. That's true here in New York and in other states where abortion is legal. Today, we've gathered together a bunch of really amazing experts who will discuss the current landscape of reproductive justice at both the state and federal level, and what New York in particular is doing in the short and the long term to protect fundamental reproductive freedoms and futures for everyone, everywhere. I just want to thank everyone on the panel today, whether you're an NYCLU or ACLU supporter, staff, board member, partner, leader in the field of reproductive health, delivering essential services and ensuring protection and access for everyone. Thank you all for taking time out of your day and joining with us in the ongoing struggle for justice. I'm going to pass the mic, the laptop, along to Sasha Ahuja, who will be moderating this event and introducing our speakers. A word about Sasha, who I've known for a long time, years. When I go to a demonstration, if she's not there, like I look around, what's wrong? Sasha is a close friend of the NYCLU and director nationally of strategic partnerships of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. For over 15 years, she's built her career facilitating community-driven policy change in government, in the labor movement, and at the local and national progressive level. She continues to lead advocacy efforts and campaigns rooted in racial and gender equity, which is just perfect for us in New York in these times. So Sasha, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you everyone for being here this afternoon. I know a word that I've used many times in the last 2 years, maybe since the 2016 election, is that we are in unprecedented times. Today, it feels like we are truly, truly in unprecedented times when we consider the fight ahead of us for gender justice, for reproductive justice, reproductive freedom, and the world that we want to build. I'm so honored to be here in community with all of you, really to lean on the expertise across our movement and to be able to share perspectives from around New York as to what the current work is, what our current charge must be, and how we can move forward in a state like New York, where we believe and know that access will always be protected. And at the same time, we also know that we're having this conversation where we live in a state where Black women are 8 times more likely than their white counterparts to die during childbirth here in New York City. those disparities are even more significant. When we think about full reproductive freedom and equity, the current fight that Donna laid out so clearly ahead of us on access to medication abortion, we know it's the communities that have historically been deeply oppressed by our systems, whether it's our medical systems, our criminal justice system, who continue to bear the brunt of ban after ban after ban. Today, we're having this conversation as we approach the 1-year anniversary of the overturn of Roe v. Wade. We know that Roe was always the floor, never the ceiling. Today, we have 18 states around the country with some version of an abortion ban, from an all-out ban to bans at 6 weeks, at 10 weeks, at 12 weeks, and at 18 weeks. And again, the communities most harmed are Black and Brown communities, low-income communities, immigrant communities, young people, and poor folks across the United States. We have a mandate here in New York to continue to make sure that access is protected, and we continue to build an equitable system where everyone can get the healthcare that they need when they need it, full stop. Our panel today, as Donna began to lay out, is made up of top policy, legal, and advocacy experts, many of whom I've had the privilege of working with over the years. The folks you'll hear from work tirelessly day in and day out to secure reproductive freedom. First up, we'll hear from Lindsay Cayley, staff attorney at the Reproductive Freedom Project at the ACLU. She'll walk us through ACLU's view of the current state of reproductive rights across the US, legal trends, a lens on accessibility, and how the ACLU is responding in this unprecedented moment. And a little bit about how ACLU is working with affiliates, including in blue states like here in New York. Next, we're going to hear from an all-star who many of us know, deeply admire. Chelsea Williams-Diggs serves as interim executive director of the New York Abortion Access Fund. Chelsea will share the critical work that NYCLU is doing across New York to bridge care for so many folks here locally who are seeking abortion care across the spectrum, and many people who are traveling into New York to seek care in a moment when so many states are rolling back protection. After Chelsea, we'll have the privilege of hearing from Catherine Bodie, NYCLU's Assistant Policy Director, to talk about legislative and policy work at the NYCLU and how we're positioning New York to lead the way to cause some good trouble. And finally, we'll hear from Jenna Lutter, an Equal Justice Works Fellow who engages in policy advocacy and litigation for reproductive health care. Jenna will talk a little bit about NYCLU's work around pregnancy justice and informed consent. And then, of course, we're so eager to take your questions. Many of you who are joining today might see a toolbar on the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. We'll provide a little bit of guidance throughout today's chat to make sure you can drop your questions in, and we'll field those questions to the robust panel of experts. A friend of mine says we have a leaderful movement across the reproductive justice, health, and rights movement, and so you'll hear a little bit of the expertise here. So feel free to use that Q&A function as questions are coming up, and we'll make sure those questions are answered. With that, I have the privilege of turning it over to Lindsay, who'll talk a little bit about this work. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Sasha, and thank you to NYCLU for pulling this event together. I am so pleased to be able to be speaking with all of you here today, even if the conditions are unfortunately less than ideal. So in the Reproductive Freedom Project at the National ACLU, we are continuing to see the effects of the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs. As I'm sure you are all familiar with the court's decision last year, Dobbs overturned Roe versus Wade and its progeny, including Planned Parenthood versus Casey, thereby eliminating the federal constitutional protection for the right to abortion under the right to privacy. But that decision was not the end of the fight, and certainly only the beginning of new legal challenges on our part and new ways of working to protect reproductive rights across the country. Since Dobbs, we have seen a proliferation of abortion bans go into effect across the country, as well as the resurrection of zombie laws restricting access to abortion, in some cases going back to before states were even states themselves. So we've seen challenges but we've continued to bring challenges to these abortion restrictions, even without the protection of Roe under other federal constitutional provisions that were unaffected by Dobbs. For instance, bringing free speech challenges to laws that restrict the ability to provide referrals for abortion. We've brought vagueness challenges where laws are unconstitutionally vague. And we've also brought challenges under state constitutions to try to build out state protections for reproductive rights, and in some ways trying to argue for even broader protections than were available under Roe. These have all been difficult fights, and they're all ongoing, and it means that the availability of abortion in various states continues to change, and unfortunately, it has meant that bans have gone into effect, including across the South, and we're looking at Florida, for instance, which is sort of the last holdout in the South where abortion remains legal, but we are following a bill where it could soon mean that the entire South does not have access to abortion, putting pressure not just on the neighboring states, but on entire other regions to try to provide care to people who need access to reproductive health care, including abortion. So that means that as these challenges continue, we're already witnessing the profound legal and practical implications that Dobbs and reversing Roe has had on the country. As I said, and as others have already noted, the impact of these abortion bans, as has always been the case with abortion bans, even before Roe was reversed, is falling disproportionately on people who already face systemic barriers to care. Those are communities of color, the LGBTQ community, undocumented immigrants, young people, those living in rural areas, people with disabilities, and people with low incomes. For those in banned states, trying to get out of the state requires resources, time, money, support, and for some, those barriers are simply insurmountable. So I just wanted to take a moment and pause on that profound reality. But in a legal sense, Dobbs has also put at risk other unenumerated constitutional rights. The court wrote in Dobbs that the Constitution makes no reference to abortion and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision. This way of thinking about the Constitution puts at risk marriage equality and LGBTQ rights and access to contraception. And we know opponents are already considering challenges to these rights. We don't think it's going to end with abortion. And then opposition to abortion, separate and apart from Dobbs and Roe, also impacts other areas of the ACLU's practice. For example, in New York, as well as several other states with protective laws, we've seen free exercise clause used to argue that employers should not have to comply with a law requiring insurance coverage for abortion care for their employees. That vision and that argument, that religion where of religious rights where each individual can be granted an exemption from a law that they oppose, regardless of the harm to others, could be used to undermine other rights, including the religious rights of others. And it absolutely will underwrite one particular religious view over others. And fundamentally, religious rights is a democracy issue. While abortion rights have widespread support reflected in election after election and numerous ballot measures, gerrymandering and voter suppression mean that we are contending with policies and politicians that don't reflect that reality. So protecting voting rights is also how we protect abortion access. All of these intersecting practical and legal implications of Dobbs and opposition to abortion makes the ACLU, if I can say so, an ideal place to be doing this work. We cover so many of these issue areas, which means that we are able to row in the same direction with our colleagues, look to our colleagues for support and advice and expertise. And it's not just about the different issue areas that the ACLU covers. It's also the fact that we have affiliates in all 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico and DC. So as we see these laws, good or bad, being introduced, we can turn to those affiliates to be on the front end and the front line of either opposing or supporting those initiatives. So for instance, we work with affiliates across the country in favor of various state legislation that we're seeing proposed. So we are seeing states and cities allocating funds to pay for abortions for those who can't afford it. We're seeing states eliminate barriers to mid-level clinicians to provide abortion care. And we're seeing states enshrining the right to abortion in state statutes or constitutions. And of course, we're seeing our opponents acting on the state level as well. So we're seeing our opponents try to increase criminal penalties, including for self-induced abortion. We're seeing our opponents try to pass bills at the state level to prohibit providing even just information about abortion in another state, and to prevent people from leaving the state or helping people try to leave the state. We're seeing the establishment of fetal personhood, either through legislation at the state and frankly at the federal level as well as a concern, and even a nationwide abortion ban is a concern on that basis. And we're seeing efforts to eliminate the protection for access to contraception. So Dobbs was not just about shifting the litigation landscape, what claims we bring and where. At its root, Dobbs was about a profound reordering of state power and control. Where prior to Dobbs, there were certain, of course, abortion laws varied from state to state, but as others have said, it was a constitutional floor that applied nationwide. That's not the case anymore. And the decision in many parts of the country now rests with the government. So on one side of a state border, the ability to end a pregnancy is not just illegal, but a fundamental right under the state constitution. And you might have a situation where on the other side of that same border, a state has passed a law saying a fertilized egg has all the legal rights of a full human being. That kind of fractured landscape, in addition to causing a logistical nightmare for patients and providers alike, has also raised really novel and complicated questions about the balance of power in our federal system and how individual states and governments relate to each other. We really rely on our state affiliates to be on the front line of these issues and to be expanding access in their own states wherever possible, and expanding protections for providers and patients alike to diminish these risks to providing care and ensure that as many people as possible are still able to access this care. Because on a human level, these laws are really aimed at isolating folks who need abortions from their communities, stigmatizing and criminalizing healthcare providers. The civil organizations and the charities exist to help people access the care that they need. And that makes affiliates like NYCLU and states like New York even more important to send a strong message about protections for abortion access. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea to talk about why it's so important to protect abortion access in states like New York. Take it away, Chelsea.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Williams-Diggs. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the interim executive director at the New York Abortion Access Fund, or NYAF. I'm really grateful to be in space with you all to, I think, gather and really understand the complexity and the seriousness of this moment in our movement's history. And also happy, as always, to really elevate the work of abortion funds across the country and of course in New York, and the really critical work that we do, and all the knowledge and expertise that we bring to the larger movement as we work in partnership, of course, with organizations across the state and across the country. So just a little bit of background on me. I started with NYAF as a volunteer case manager and then joined the board of directors. And then I started as interim executive director in September 2022, excuse me. And I'm our first and only full-time paid staff member. I work alongside a truly powerhouse of volunteers, including our board of directors, as well as our volunteer case managers, who do the day-to-day work of NYAF and of supporting our callers and community. And at my core, I'm someone who firmly believes in the power of community, and I believe and know that funding abortion is a radical act of community care. I'm really excited to talk more with you all about the work that we do and what we're seeing on the ground, and why it's important to really think about access as we're continuing to think about rights. So I will share a little bit about NIAF for folks who aren't familiar, and for others, I apologize for the same spiel that I often give, but reminders are important. So NIAF is New York's only and statewide abortion fund. And our mission is pretty simple. We pay for people's abortions. So we support people living in or traveling to New York who cannot afford the cost of their procedure. We've existed since 2001, which I think is really important to highlight. We are also a member of the National Network of Abortion Funds. So we are in deep community with abortion funds across the country, and we have been in deep community with abortion funds across the country. And, you know, our mere existence long before the fall of Roe is proof that there have always been gaps between rights and access, and abortion funds have been working hard for decades to fill those gaps. And we've been doing so in partnership with each other. You know, long before Roe fell, there were folks who have had to leave their state to access care for a variety of reasons, including, you know, gestational limits, other kind of unnecessary waiting periods or exams, or mandatory parental involvement, among many others as well. Let's see. And NIAF works really relatively simply. So at our core, we believe no one should be denied access to an abortion because of where they live or how much money they make. As I mentioned, we're powered by volunteers, and we primarily case managers who work directly with callers to provide compassionate, judgment-free case management and support, and who also move funds directly on their behalf. So to put this simply, as someone who is pregnant and no longer wants to be, and realizes that they can't afford the cost of their abortion, will call us, be connected to a case manager. The case manager will support them in figuring out if there are other needs to get them to their appointment, right? So that includes travel, childcare, that might include figuring out what's the right place to get an appointment, you know, especially if they're, for example, over a certain gestational age, and they might need to reschedule. And then, of course, providing that emotional support and case management that really kind of holistically supports people to get there. And then finally, we directly move funds to clinics on abortion seekers' behalves. And NIAF does not have caller restrictions or requirements, and we support 100% of callers and trust them as experts in their own experience, which is something that does really make us unique. And I'll talk more about how our model is currently at risk. But for the time being, we're really proud to continue to support 100% of callers. But yeah, every day we hear stories from callers, from folks who are New Yorkers, from folks who are living across the country. And we're reminded that, you know, their stories and their expertise should be centered in programmatic work and, of course, in policy. And abortion funds have a really unique position in this movement, since we are working so closely with the folks who are being directly impacted by these barriers. And, you know, the past year has been a wild one for all of us, personally, professionally, in the movement. In 2022, NIAF pledged $1.2 million on behalf of 1,800 abortion seekers. Our people's leaders, $1.2 million on behalf of 1,800 abortion seekers. That is not normal. The year before, we pledged just over $500,000. So we more than doubled our funding for folks directly on the ground. And the year before that, in 2020, we pledged just over 200,000. So we've been growing at an unprecedented rate. And in 2023, we're on track to move between $2 and $3 million. And since the fall of Roe, NIAF has supported callers from 30 states, 29 states in the District of Columbia, which should be a state, as well as 6 countries, which I think is also important. I think sometimes when we're talking about this work, we simplify to make the talking points, but we really need to, I think, complicate our understanding of this moment and recognize that so many folks, of course, are traveling throughout the US, and there are still often folks who are coming from outside of the country to access care in New York. And we know that many of the reasons that people are traveling to New York is because they have connections to folks who live here. New York as a state, and New York City particularly, is an extremely, extremely diverse state with folks that have many deep ties with people across the world, right, and across the country. And we know that particularly we've seen the most large increase in folks from Texas and from, Texas, Florida, and Georgia. And that perhaps isn't surprising for many people because they have so many people who have connections, family members, friends, and others who live in these states. Sorry. Excuse me. So, and it's really interesting, I think what's happening in Florida is really scary, right? So Florida right now has a 15-week ban, right? So many Floridians are coming into New York to access care. But if this 6-week ban passes, I'm not sure if there's been any updates today, but we know that there's things moving in their state legislators now. And if that is banned, New York will directly see an effect, probably overnight. And again, Florida is already one of our most represented states, next to Texas, Georgia, and then of course neighboring states such as Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and states throughout New England. And one of the other things I want to highlight is, when the Dobbs first fell, Ohio had a ban in place shortly after, and Ohio was the most represented state being seen from NYCLU, New York, of course. And since their ban has since been reversed and they're able to provide care to, I believe, 22, maybe around then weeks, we've seen virtually no Ohioans coming into New York, right? And particularly what's really interesting is I think, sometimes we forget how upstate New York particularly also felt the impacts of the Dobbs decision. I want to wrap this up, but before I do, I really want to dispel a myth about New York as an access state. So I so much gratitude for the policymakers that we do have in New York and the access that we do have throughout the state and throughout the city. But I really want us to, again, complicate our understanding of and push back against overly simplistic narratives of what post-Roe America is and who's being affected, and also what pre-Roe America was, right? I think folks have already uplifted the fact that our most marginalized, including Black communities, young people, other folks of color, low-income folks, and the undocumented community, among others, have always felt these bans and barriers and restrictions more than others. And that continues to be true, of course, in a post-Roe America. But it also means that folks who are these identities and others that are living in access states are also dealing with a variety of bans and restrictions and, of course, confusion at the national level. So I just want to really, I'm running a bit out of time, so I'm going to try to run through this quickly. But I just want to really clarify that NYCLU has existed again since 2001. And even though, of course, the fall of Roe has happened, we've seen a huge increase of folks from out of state. The majority of our callers are still resident New Yorkers, meaning that there are still many, many New Yorkers who have difficulty accessing abortion, right? That means even with all of our protections, even if with us quite literally advertising ourselves as an access state and an access city, we have resident New Yorkers who are struggling to access abortion. We cannot forget those folks, and we cannot, in our efforts to, characterize ourselves as an access state, invisibilize their real experiences. It's irresponsible, and it's truly not, it's not fair for the real experiences of people that we're supporting. So we know that particularly the undocumented community in New York City and in New York is a community that struggles to access healthcare of all services, but particularly abortion. And as we've seen, NYCLU has seen an increase of folks coming, recently migrated folks who've really taken long journeys to reach New York, coming with often pregnancies, later pregnancies, who need abortion care and need the services of NYCLU in order to get those. We also have, of course, folks who make too much money to be eligible for Medicaid, but still don't have insurance and aren't able to cover out-of-cost pockets for abortion. And then there are folks that have Medicaid. There are many clinics across the state and the city who don't accept Medicaid, either at all or past certain gestational limits. right? Which means that many people that have Medicaid still need NIAF services in order to access abortion. And there are many other folks who kind of fall through the various cracks and barriers. And we know when we talk about our work and our movements being intersectional, right, and people living full, whole lives, we see that in real time, right? We see that folks, resident New Yorkers, are struggling to access care because of economic, racial, immigration, justice issues that are intersecting in real time and in their lives. So I can wrap up by saying, this most recent attack on medication abortion, and particularly on MIFI, unfortunately was not a surprise for any of us. And yet I still want to be honest in that I think that abortion funds and other folks doing grassroots work are really struggling to keep up with the changing landscape. And we know this landscape is not going to particularly get better, right? It's likely that it'll get more difficult. So really, again, needing to uplift the work of grassroots organizations, abortion funds, and practical support organizations to really understand what is the reality on the ground and how do we continue to support those? How do we create policy, legislation, programs, even messaging, right? That really centers the real experiences. And again, I challenge us to be more complicated in our analysis and our understanding of this time so that we are really honoring the real experiences of folks on the ground. So I just wanted to say that, NIAF is in the middle of our large fundraising campaign, and we invite folks to get connected with us on social media and support us in grassroots fundraising. And of course, continuing to keep an eye out on various policies and legislation at the state and city level, support us directly, and of course, support the movement more broadly. Which is a perfect segue. I will pass to Catherine, who can talk to us about the many great pieces of legislation and policy priorities that NYCLU are doing to support the grassroots folks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Hey, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm so grateful that we have the opportunity to come together today. It's so critical that we continue to have these conversations, that we continue to affirm that what is happening is not okay, and that we use these spaces to source energy for what will surely be work that will last well beyond our lifetimes. And so just a shout out to our NYCLU team for creating this space and to our amazing speakers and to you all for taking the time to join. My role here today, as Chelsea just said, is to really focus us in on the policy front in New York, what we are doing and the work that lies ahead. Certainly, the road ahead is steep. Our other speakers have really made the case for why it is so important for states like New York to step up and lead. 10 months ago, after the Dobbs decision, not only does access to abortion care depend on where you live, but also whether you can be criminalized for that care. And we are only beginning to really understand the fallout of what this all means. And while access deserts and even criminalization for abortion is nothing new, the scale of it in this moment can feel a bit overwhelming. Every week, we are seeing fill in the blank bans, fill in the blank restrictions, and beyond eliminating abortion care access, what these laws are meant to do and what they do is to stigmatize, is to confuse, and ultimately to intimidate people from accessing the care that they really urgently need. Me and certainly others experience these bans and restrictions as I've described it as shocks to the system. That's certainly how it felt when the Dobbs decision dropped. And that continues. The medication abortion decision coming out of Texas on Friday felt unbelievable. If you are a person who believes in judicial restraint and adherence to the rule of law. It can be such an intensely distressing dichotomy to navigate between understanding our greatest potential as a people and also the ways in which we are so deeply backwards and destructive. And while I think it's really easy for us to focus on courts and legislatures as the source of that harm, the harm is really as deep as history. It is as old as patriarchy. And so to unwind it, we really must have a vision to match that scale. The writer and educator Erica Miners has said that liberation under oppression is unthinkable by design. I'll repeat that. Liberation under oppression is unthinkable by design. And so we are really called upon to direct our attention and energy toward future, toward possibility, to vision what liberation looks like, to move past shock and response mode. This year would have been the 50th anniversary of Roe. And to understand that kind of vision for the future, we really need to reflect on the tension in Roe's legacy, as I think has been named by Chelsea and by Lindsay as well. Roe's privacy-based framework was never enough to advance or even really robustly protect people's decision-making, bodily autonomy, and dignity. In many instances, Roe was actually used against people to actually limit their decision-making. And still, it was a really critical backstop for people around the country who needed to get care. And we need to hold that tension in our minds so that we can contemplate the loss of Roe, so that we can really reimagine what can and should be, and what can and should step into that space, beyond the constraints of judges, beyond the constraints of courts and legislatures. And this is a vision that imagines that all people within our communities have autonomy over their body, have autonomy over their health, and really the power to make decisions about their health and their families, along with the means to see those decisions through. And this vision must be reflected in our state's founding document. But, and this is a big but, the New York State Constitution does not clearly contain protections for LGBT people, for women, for those with disabilities, and particularly for our purposes here, for pregnant people and their ability to make decisions about their pregnancies, their lives, their health, and their future. Decisions that are really integral to a person's equality. The NYCLU, along with our sister organizations, will be preparing to change that. And we have our work cut out for us. In 2024, there will be a constitutional amendment on the ballot that will broadly prevent discrimination against people regardless of their pregnancy outcome, ensuring access to reproductive decision-making and autonomy. This is a matter of justice and it is a matter of equality. And importantly, the measure that will be on the ballot adds to existing race and religious protections, anti-discrimination language that would explicitly advance equality for gender justice, for disability justice, our LGBT community, and more. And the pregnancy protections within the proposal situate abortion protections within a broader framework of all pregnancy outcomes. And that's important. So we as a movement can really acknowledge, honor, and protect the various ways that pregnant people are targeted and punished and prosecuted. By doing so, we are really ensuring that Black and Brown women's experiences are reflected and prioritized by our movement. So it is really important that we amend the New York State Constitution to make sure that we are, our founding document reflects our values, affirms people's equality, and so that we can really step into a leadership role for the rest of the country. There are many other pieces of our legislative agenda and policy agenda that I could lift up here. But on our website, we actually have an abortion access roadmap, and I would direct you to that to learn more. One specifically that I want to lift up before handing the mic to Jenna is around funding care. Specifically, we are including as a priority, pushing a provision in the New York State budget that would create a sustainable funding mechanism for abortion access in New York. It is named the Reproductive Freedom and Equity Program, and it is a grant program that would be open to providers as well as abortion funds like NYCLU to ensure that we are investing in the future of care and the infrastructure of care in our state. And now I'm going to hand it over to my amazing colleague, Jenna, to talk about another critical thread in our pregnancy justice work. Thanks all.
Thank you, Catherine. So in this conversation about reproductive rights, abortion is understandably the focal point, especially in this moment. But I just want to take a few minutes to expand the frame through which we're viewing and advocating for reproductive rights and freedoms, to confront the fact that this is not just about abortion. And as I think Catherine spoke to so beautifully, you know, this is about larger forces of misogyny, of racism, classism, and really an enduring campaign to control women and pregnant people. So while abortion is oftentimes the flashpoint in this fight, there are many other ways that society undermines women's reproductive autonomy, especially when we consider intersections with racial and economic oppression. So today I'll speak about one of these practices, drug testing of pregnant people and their newborns, which, like abortion bans, disproportionately harms low-income Black and Brown women. Before I dig into what this practice actually looks like and its implications for equality and autonomy, I'd like to take a minute to situate it in its historical and institutional context. For as long as this country has existed, essentially, Black and Brown women's reproduction has been undermined and controlled. The system of American slavery relied on the commodification and exploitation of enslaved Black women's reproductive capacity as fuel for economic growth. This system depended on denying enslaved mothers custody of their children, who the law regarded as property. To justify this cruelty, those in power at the time developed narratives devaluing Black motherhood and giving rise to stereotypes that reverberate in society today. In particular, these echoes can still be felt in what advocates refer to as the family regulation system, known by many as the child welfare system. This system is really the institutionalized embodiment of longstanding efforts at reproductive and social control, especially over specific communities. The terminology of regulation and policing more accurately reflects what the system actually does. It surveils and punishes predominantly Black, Brown, and Indigenous low-income parents, most often mothers, for perceived shortcomings in their parenting, which in the vast majority of cases stem from circumstances related to poverty. People living below the poverty line are 22 times more likely to become involved with the family regulation system. And contrary to what might be popular perception, only a slim minority of family regulation cases, about 13%, actually relate to allegations of physical abuse. So I raise this system as part of today's conversation because of its sweeping implications for reproductive rights, and also for reproductive justice, a term coined by Black women to promote a more expansive view of reproductive freedom that recognizes and responds to intersectional forms of oppression, takes direction from impacted communities, and situates reproductive rights in a broader social justice framework. The family regulation system continues to undermine the goals of reproductive justice. It operates as a vehicle for government disruption of pregnant and parenting people's lives. And one of the ways it does this is by fueling a widespread practice of drug testing and reporting pregnant people without their knowledge or consent. So to go a bit into the history, The federal government's war on drugs in the 1980s and 90s spawned, racist and decidedly debunked narratives about rampant drug use by pregnant women of color that called into question their capacity for motherhood. This led to laws, policies, and stigmatizing attitudes that encourage drug testing and reporting of positive results through the family regulation system, with Black mothers and their infants still today being more likely to be tested than their white counterparts, despite similar rates of substance use. This practice is deeply harmful and problematic for a number of reasons. First, it can lead to devastating consequences for families. A positive toxicology result is no measure of a parent's ability to care for their child, yet it often triggers an invasive investigation and even the removal of an infant from its parents in the first hours and days after birth. This, of course, flies in the face of clinical guidance and can disrupt early attachment. Unauthorized or secret drug testing also undermines trust between patients and their providers, deterring pregnant people from seeking prenatal care or being honest with their providers about substance use. Perhaps unsurprisingly, we continue to see correlations between New York City zip codes with high rates of child removals and zip codes with high rates of Black maternal mortality. Drug testing pregnant patients is also a form of sex and pregnancy discrimination. In the cases we're describing, there's no medical reason for performing these tests. They're purely investigatory to find out whether a person has used drugs while they're pregnant. This singles patients out for increased surveillance based on their pregnancy status, infringing on their privacy and their dignity. It also disregards their equal right to consent to their own healthcare while they're pregnant, privileging concern for the welfare of a fetus over the bodily autonomy of the pregnant person. And as an aside, for those of you who actually read the disturbing opinion in the Texas mifepristone case, the judge there invoked these notions of fetal personhood in his reasoning. So this concept is a slippery slope that, if it were recognized under the law, could pit the rights of a pregnant person against rights that are imputed to a fetus, undermining pregnant people's status as full and equal humans in the eyes of the law. Fortunately, law does not currently recognize fetal personhood, but drug testing pregnant people and using that as evidence of child neglect or maltreatment feeds into these similar ideas. Here at the NYCLU, we are currently representing a client who was drug tested without her consent at a New York hospital. In this case, we're making this argument to the New York State Division of Human Rights that drug testing and reporting pregnant people constitute sex and pregnancy discrimination under the state's human rights law. The commission issued a determination late last year, finding that there is probable cause to conclude that drug testing of pregnant people amounts to discrimination under this law. This is great, and it will allow our case to proceed to a public hearing where we will hope to establish our position more conclusively. Simultaneously, the NYCLU is working alongside coalition partners to advance legislation in the New York State legislature that would require healthcare providers to obtain patients' explicit written and verbal informed consent before drug testing a pregnant patient or their newborn. This law alone is not enough to eliminate the underlying racial biases and disregard for pregnant people's bodily autonomy that underpin current drug testing practices, but it would be an important step towards curbing family regulation harms and reinforcing that pregnancy is no excuse to ignore the fundamental principles of informed consent. This work is even more urgent as criminalization of pregnancy is on the rise. Between 2006 and 2020, Pregnancy Justice, formerly known as National Advocates for Pregnant Women, documented over 1,300 cases in which being pregnant was a necessary element of the crime. As states increasingly seek to pass laws telling women and pregnant people what they can and can't do with their bodies, I can only imagine we'll continue to see more of these types of cases in the future. Although New York is not one of the states, fortunately, that criminalizes drug use during pregnancy, this national trend helps illustrate how drug testing pregnant people is part and parcel of the comprehensive and longstanding assault on women's bodily autonomy and rights to determine their own reproductive futures. All of these issues are interconnected: abortion, bodily autonomy during pregnancy, and family integrity as people raise their children. We're in a world where the state can force a person to birth a child with one hand, surveil and punish them for their choices during pregnancy with the other, and then even remove that child from its parent instead of supporting the family and thriving together. So as we fight for reproductive rights after Dobbs, it's imperative that we do so through an intersectional lens that recognizes the ways misogyny, racism, and poverty conspire against reproductive rights, birth, and family justice, and that we affirm women's and pregnant people's equality and opportunity for self-determination at every stage of their reproductive journey. And on that note, I will pass it back to Sasha.
Excellent. Thank you so much to our esteemed panel. We heard so much. I just want to lift up two things that really stuck with me in all of the brilliance that we just heard in a really short amount of time. Just want to lift up Chelsea's note that continuing to focus on New York as an access state ignores how challenging, and I would add, of course, how unequal our healthcare system really is, and the points that we just heard from Jenna in particular truly spoke to that in the ways in which our criminal justice and family surveillance systems interact with the lives of everyday New Yorkers. And Catherine encouraged us to move past shock and response mode and truly imagine what liberation looks like. So I'm holding on to those things very closely. Want to invite folks to ask our panelists some questions, and we already have a couple. Again, just as a reminder, we just have a few minutes for this. We'll get to a few. On the bottom of your toolbar, you'll see a Q&A function that is a little button that has two chat bubbles, and we will ask you to drop your question there. And then our esteemed backend team is sourcing some of these. One question that came up, which we'll start with. For folks that live in states considered less progressive, how can we encourage folks in those states to move towards change in their places of residence? That's a big question. So we know we cannot leave any of our states behind. Would love to invite any of our panelists to list up also, like, what are you inspired by? What are you seeing in states that we see folks are struggling to get access? Bans are very, very real and impacting folks. What encouragement, what advice, what inspiration might you offer? Lindsay, that might be a question for you. Chelsea, that might be a question for you on the fund side. Feel free to jump in.
Sure. So I kind of return to something I said earlier in introducing this issue, which we actually know that there's a lot of support in these states for abortion. And in some of these situations, there's certainly the general advice, which is, you can share individual stories. There's incredible movements out there. We testify, other groups who are talking about what abortion has meant to them, how important that access was to their life, and tell stories. Unfortunately, we're seeing the real impacts, and there's been coverage of just really, truly terrifying situations that people have found themselves in where they're pregnant and facing medical situations. And so certainly continuing to share those stories and the reality of what abortion means, not even in just these extreme cases, but just to be able to exercise your bodily autonomy, to be able to choose the direction of your life. Talking about abortion as healthcare is really important, I think, to changing those narratives. But all of that is to say, abortion is actually widely supported, and we've seen since Dobbs that in ballot initiatives where they've tried to protect abortion access, and in those have been passed, we've seen attempts to say that state constitutions don't protect abortion access. Those have been defeated. We just saw in Wisconsin a state Supreme Court justice who vocally supported reproductive rights and abortion rights get elected in a purple state at best, you might say. So the fact is that the support is there, and continuing to find ways to also support other basic rights like voting rights and things like that is also really crucial to this battle. And I think also then benefits so many other of the issues of the ACLU and we care about, whether it be, our people fighting for access to gender affirming care and the attacks on that, or just, all these other racial and economic issues that justice issues that we care about. So I think that's another way to look at it, is that the support is there. We need to find better political pathways to make sure that our politicians and the policies actually reflect the will of the people. And I'm open to other suggestions for how to talk about this as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lindsay. And Chelsea, is there anything on the fun world that you maybe could speak to around how folks are boldly showing up in this moment, including in red and purple states?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we need to trust and uplift and elevate the work of folks who are doing the grassroots organizing and direct support on the ground, both, of course, home here in New York and in red, quote unquote, red states or banned and restricted states. So, for example, in the abortion fund land, Texas, believe it or not, had a win. In that Texas funds won some legal thing that allows them to now support citizens who are going out of state. So we're seeing a variety of Texas abortion funds starting back up, right, and being able to provide direct financial support to people who are coming out of the state. And that includes folks coming to New York. In fact, just today, we're chatting with somebody coming in from Texas, and the T Fund is helping support that caller in community with us. So really just uplifting their work and keeping an eye out on the small wins and what's happening with funds in restricted and banned states. And then I think, of course, really, again, just trusting and affirming the real work that's happening on the ground, right? The Black and brown organizers that have been doing things, right? I think we often, folks, from the Northeast or from more quote unquote progressive states can have this sense, the savior complex, right? Of, oh, we need to go help these poor folks in the South or these poor folks in banned and restricted states. And I think we need to really challenge that framing. One, for many of the reasons I mentioned earlier, because we need to get our ish together too, right? And there's plenty of folks who are struggling in our backyards, but also because there are strong lineages and histories of movement building, particularly Black and brown movement building in some of the most restrictive states and most quote unquote red states. So we need to really honor that and recognize we need to follow their lead, and of course can support with elevating their messaging, with sending money, right? But ultimately those folks have the expertise of what's needed in their communities. And then again, just really want to come back to the reality that there's a lot of things that we can be doing in our own communities and our own states for folks who are coming here from those states, but also for folks who live here.
Excellent. I see some really important questions in the chat. We'll make sure we address those, and folks who are joining today have links of all of the good materials from across our movement, important questions about New York's proposed shield law, about crisis pregnancy centers, and about what to do if we see a version of a federal ban, kind of what is the charge for New York. So acknowledging those questions, we are at time, and so want to respect yours as much as we want to respect our panelists. With that, I will pass the mic to my colleague, Shannon Wong, to close us out for today's esteemed panel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be with us. I know we have the full intention of following up with people and that we didn't get to all of the questions in the chat, some of which were, very important. So we will do our best to respond or find places in which that information is available. I want to thank Sasha for facilitating and all of the incredible speakers for sharing time with us. I want you to know that the NYCLU will keep up the fight to protect abortion care. We will fight to ensure that New Yorkers meet the increased demand, that New York is set to meet the increased demand for abortion care. And as folks on this call have noted, we will do that with a lens to the way everyone and all the additional obstacles that people are experiencing when they are seeking abortion care come to us for help, right? We will not stand by while the far right attempts to take down Roe and deny our bodily autonomy. And they've already hurt so many people. And we've talked about in this call how people of color, youth, LGBT folks, rural folks are additionally impacted by the far right's takedown of Roe. You can take some action today. I'm in the field department, so I would be remiss if I didn't give you something that you could do today to make a difference. So I will highlight for you 2 things that you can do. One of our speakers spoke about the Repro Freedom and Equity Fund, which is a fund that will sustainably fund the abortion ecostructure. It will fund the abortion fund, it will fund providers, and it will also support the logistics that people need to be able to access abortion in our state. You can find that at nyclu.org/equity fund. Also, you could donate to a group like NYAF, right? The New York Abortion Action Fund. They're on their website. Some people in the chat asked about where they could volunteer. There are links on both of our websites, the New York Abortion Action Fund and the NYCLU as options to volunteer. So I would encourage people to take us up on those opportunities, please. We also want people to know that, as Catherine alluded to, we are envisioning a large change. We are envisioning a change to the New York State Constitution that only currently protects race and religion, but we're going to expand those protections to sex, pregnancy outcomes, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, national origin, ethnicity, age, and disability in New York. I think national origin. So we are going to fight in 2024 to pass the constitutional amendment, which means we are going to need people to get up, get out, gear up, and be ready to get out the vote for this important change that will ensure that we can really get the protections in that fundamental document, in our foundational document in our New York State Constitution, that will protect a wide range of people from a wide range of issues, because that's what we need to do, right? We need to, as Catherine said, sort of envision what true liberation looks like and could look like. And so the constitutional amendment, which is currently called the ERA, people may have seen it passed a couple of times in our New York State Constitution, is our work to do that. So we intend to follow up with you after this call with a survey for feedback. We will share some action items, probably a couple of that I've already mentioned, and talk about ways that you can join with all of us to ensure the fight for protecting reproductive freedom. Thank you all very much. We will be in touch. It is my deep honor to be working with all of these people to ensure that there is freedom and equity for everyone. Thank you very much.